Actually, we tried to do that as well, but the problem was that there were not enough data, because we have to have characterized, I mean, annotated genomes. So we can have the nuclear genes from several plant genomes, the mitochondrial genes, and the chloroplastic genes. But we have to have, according to the method that we followed, of course, we have to have that in for pairs of species that they are not very distantly related. So we could find the DNDS ratios and to find the divergence. So we didn't have enough data for all these three set of genomes. That's why we didn't use those, although we checked for that. I hope that in the future we can do similar work with mitochondrial, with chloroplast DNA. Well, I don't know, Kivanch, if I prefer it, if I say it correctly, their name. Do you think this model can be used in a way to explain rapidly mutating beings like viruses? Actually, what I presented, what I said is that exactly this is the evolutionary framework that we are using. We all work. I don't know details on that, but I know, of course, that there is a hypothesis and data to support it. And if I'm mistaken, please, if other people know better than I do, please correct me, that the higher mutation rate in viruses is an adaptive characteristic for them. So they need to be, to have more mutations, because in that way they evolve faster and they can overcome the system, the immunological system of the organisms that they parasitize. So it is like arms race between organisms, and that's why, on the other hand, that the immune systems of the organisms, of the, let's say, of the mammals and other organisms, evolve faster than the other genes. The genes that they are related to the immune system evolve faster exactly for that, because there is an arms race between the parasites and the host. So yes, I think that this model can be used to explain the rapidly evolved genes. Okay. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that this is my opinion. Right. Now, so far, I talked like an evolutionary biologist. Well, I will continue talking as an evolutionary biologist. But the evolutionary theory has been extended into other scientific fields. And the first field, at least to my knowledge, that it was extended, the evolutionary theory, in a way that it was well shaped, well organized, was in the evolution of biological communities. Many of you, of course, are ecologists, and so you know better than I do what the biological community is, which is an interacting number of species, of different species, that they live in the same place, in the same location. Of course, at the same time, since they interact, they have to live in the same time. And what characterizes the communities is their species and their the abundance of their species, like in the populations are characterized by their alleles and the frequency of their alleles. Here, a community is characterized by species, number of species, different species, and the abundance of those species. And the community ecology is termed by Mark Velland, actually, the study of patterns in the diversity, abundance, and composition of species in communities, and of the processes that underlie these patterns. So it's similar what evolutionary biology is. It's very similar for the organisms, for the evolution of organisms, diversity of the populations, abundance, composition of the population, and stuff like that. But here we are talking about community ecologies. And the extension of the evolutionary theory into community ecology came from about 11 years ago, in 2010, from Mark Velland. In this, I think, very important seminal paper, Conceptual Synthesis in Community Ecology, and in a number of papers from Mark Velland and books that published later. So Mark Velland in this paper says, actually others have said that, but he mentioned it as well, that community ecology is a mess. Is a mess in what term? Of course, it's a very well studied field, and that's why there are a lot of patterns that to be explained, and these patterns have been explained with a lot of underlying processes. For example, I don't know, a pattern like the distribution of the species area, or models, or the niche models, or there are different models and patterns to explain different processes have been used to explain different patterns. And he says, I don't like to quote to quote things exactly, but I think that is interesting. We can likewise articulate a very general theory of community ecology, a very general theory. What is this theory? Species are added to a communities via speciation and dispersal, and the relative abundances of these species are then shaped by drift and selection, as well as ongoing dispersal to drive community dynamics. So if you have a community or two communities or several communities, then the new species are introduced, the new variation, the de novo variation is introduced by speciation. And also the variation can be increased by dispersal when species come from different communities. And then once you have a specific variation in a community, the fate of this variation is shaped by either random processes like drift or non-random processes, which is selection. And of course, ongoing dispersal. And this drives the community dynamics. So he says, okay, if these are the processes that happen and determine the community dynamics, then we can borrow the concepts from the population genetics. We can use the population genetics as a guide to make our own theory. And also in that paper, in the following papers, he made these analogs: the mutation with the speciation, selection with environmental filtering, drift is the same, and migration as dispersal. So speciation is, as we said, the introduction of the de novo variation in the population. Selection is the non-random process, and here of the structure that determines the structure of a community, and here is the environment. There are also random processes. For example, the niche the niche hypothesis that each species has its own niche is a selective, is selection, okay? But the species area model, which says that the higher higher an area, I mean the broader, the larger an area, the more species it has. It's partly random hypothesis driven by drift. And also you have migration, the exchange of genetic information in the population. Here is the dispersal, the exchange of species between different communities. So this approach here is, of course, for me, it's very appealing. It's very sexy, let's say, because it's a new approach. It's a neat idea, and I like that. But also, it has practical consequences, because it can, as the evolutionary theory offers for the evolution of the organisms, this theory here, this extension, adds, makes a new framework under which we can make testable predictions. In other words, we can make science, because this is science. So I'll give you two examples, one quite naive from my own research, and another example. Within this framework. So we would like to find what are the factors that determine the microbial communities in several gulfs in Western Aegean Sea. These are the gulfs here. So what we did is that we went to in these gulfs, and we took some sediments from the within the gulfs, from this bend of the sea, and we characterized the communities, the microbial communities, using the 16S RNA and NGS and next generation sequencing techniques. These techniques you will learn later in this course, and also the way that you can analyze these techniques in very interesting topics. Also, in these environments, we measured a number of environmental factors. And then we measured, or we estimated, the beta diversity, or the diversity, the differences between the different communities. Okay. And I will not present you the whole work, but I think that it's interesting to show you this table here. So we correlated, we tried to find what is the variation between the communities, beta diversity, that is explained by different environmental factors. And here is the numbers, but I want to concentrate on two of them. The first one is the age. The age is the redox potential. And the second one is the distance between the communities. These two factors can explain quite a lot of the variation between the communities. But if you look closer, then the EH is a selective factor, because it is the environment. This says that two communities that they live in the same EH, in similar EH, are more similar than others that they live in different EH, redox potential. So this is completely selective factor. On the other hand, the distance between them, between the communities, also determines to some extent their variation. The more distantly related to communities, the more divergent they are, more different they are. This distance is a non-selective factor, is basically dispersal or drift. So under this framework, we can ask this kind of questions. Is it selection that plays a role or not? And what is the role of selection? And as we saw previously, if we would like to make it more explicit, then it gets complicated, but the framework is the same. Now, the second experiment. It's a paper from in Proceedings of Royal Society by Gilbert and Levin, published a few years ago. Ecological drift and the distribution of species diversity. I think that's a very nice experiment. So these guys here studied plant communities of six different sizes, smaller communities, bigger communities. They had a lot of replicates for each size. They tried to cultivate them in a common environment, so to reduce the effect of the environment. And they observed the communities for 3 years. And they measure, of course, what is the observation of the communities? They measured the species richness and the abundances of them. And the diversity, of course, beta diversity, alpha diversity within these communities. And here are some results of them. So here, for example, is the abundance, the relative abundance of several species. These are several plant species. And you see that in the first, second, and third year, and you see that they started from this relative abundance, all of them, and then during the time, they change their abundances, like drift predicts. This is exactly what drift predicts not only drift, actually. It can also be selection, but selection was reduced here because they were raised in the same environment. But they also observed that the species richness increased as the community size increased. There was a positive correlation. This is exactly what you expect when you have neutral variation. From the evolutionary theory, we know that neutral nucleotide diversity is increased in bigger populations. So it depends on the population size, effective population size. Larger populations have more diversity. And here is what they observed as well. So drift seems to play a role in these communities. Also, another observation is that here is in this axis, in the x-axis, is the variation between the communities, and this is a measurement of the variation, the FST. And here is the size of in the x-axis is the size of the communities. And you see that there is a negative correlation, particularly in the second and in the third years. This means that smaller communities diverged more than larger communities. This cannot be selective, of course, but can be explained under the drift hypothesis, because what drift does, if you have two similar communities, and you observe them in time, you expect that under drift, alternative species will increase their frequency in one community, and other species will increase the community, their frequencies in the other community, just by chance, okay? Just by chance. And the results of the drift are more prominent in smaller populations than in the larger populations. So this is what they explain their results with the dominance of drift in their communities. I don't know if that's clear. If you have any question, if you don't understand that, just stop me and ask me. So, okay. Well, I dare to say that this prediction that smaller communities diverge more is something like nearly neutral theory in the evolutionary biology. I don't know if all of you know neutral theory, but Tomoko Ota students, Kimura students, show that mutations are effectively neutral. I'll explain that in a moment. Yeah, Maria, you will understand it now, and I'll come back to your question if you haven't understood that. No, I will go back to explain you. So let's imagine that you have two communities, two small communities. Okay. Well, two is not enough, but let's make the example with the two communities. That they start, they are similar, they are the same. We put them to be the same, like they have done here. Drift is expected to be more prominent in smaller communities. So what drift does is that it drives the allele frequencies or the species abundances into the extreme sequence, into the extreme frequencies or abundances, 0 and 1. And this will be more prominent in smaller populations. Drift will be more prominent. But if you think that you have two communities, that they have species with increased or decreased frequencies, 0 or 1, or close to 0 or to 1, then in this 3-year time, in the smaller communities, alternative species, different species would have increased their frequencies. And because of that, the species 1 in one community, the species 2 in the other community. So this increases the divergence between the communities, the differences between the communities. We don't expect to be that prominent, the difference to be that prominent in the bigger communities, because in the bigger communities, drift doesn't work very well. I don't know if that's it's clearer now. Good. Okay, but this is a prediction that nearly neutral theory does. So Ota showed that the mutations are effectively neutral, selective mutations, that they have a selection coefficient different than 0. So selective mutations are effectively neutral when their selection coefficient is smaller than the reciprocal of the effective population size. Okay, I'll explain that in an example here to understand it. This means that if we have two species, human species and mouse, human has a very low effective population size, 10,000, and mouse has an effective population size of 600,000. So mouse population is larger than the human population. Then mutations that have a selection coefficient between these two numbers, they will behave as neutral in the human population, but as selective in the mouse population. And given that most of the selective mutations are deleterious mutations, okay, in the smaller populations, the deleterious mutations that they have this selection coefficient will be fixed like neutral with the same rate as the neutral mutation. The probability of fixation is equal to the neutral ones because it behaves like neutral. Of course, it doesn't stop to be harmful. It is harmful, but the probability of fixation is like the neutral one. Okay? Whereas this same mutation in the big population will be removed by selection, because selection will recognize it as deleterious and will remove it. I don't know if that's clear. So smaller populations, you expect to accumulate mutations in a higher rate than the largest populations, like this here. I don't know if that's clear or not. Okay. So, great. So the evolutionary theory can be extended to the community ecology. I didn't do that extension, of course. Mark Vellen did. This extension is a neat theoretical approach. It's very nice, it's sexy, but also it creates a new theoretical framework to make testable predictions. If you, I encourage you to look in the Google Scholar or in any other searching machine with the terms of drift and ecology, selection and ecology. So into concepts that are in both fields, evolutionary biology and ecology and community ecology, and you will see how many papers they will appear. There were hundreds or even thousands of those. That is because a new theoretical framework has been put in this field. Well, another extension of the evolutionary theory is in language change. And we say language change and not language evolution because the linguists with the term language evolution mean the evolution of the brain in order to perceive the language. So here we are talking about the change of the languages, how we come from the ancient Greek to the modern Greek, from the Latin to Roman and Spanish and Italian and so forth. So this is language change here, but sometimes I will call it language evolution. It will be similar like this. Well, it was known from the time, Darwin's time, actually Darwin himself recognized parallels between the language evolution or language change, I mean, with the change of the organisms. And perhaps this was the reason why linguists affected by the evolutionary biology classified the language in the same way like we classify the organisms. They classify them into families and into genera. Here is the Indo-European family. There are many genera, Germanic, Italic, Celtic, and stuff like that. And also within this genera, there are several languages. This classification means that the languages evolve and they have common ancestor. That's why English and German are more similar than English and Spanish, for example, because they have more common ancestor. The question is, how do they change? As the ecology, the community ecology, this field is really, I mean, I was impressed the first time that I came into contact with this field. I was impressed how extensive the research that has been done on this field. But I think that they lack also a general theory on that. And this theory can be borrowed by evolutionary biology, the evolutionary theory. So we can say, if we would like to extend the evolutionary theory in the language change, then we can say that language can change with the same four processes as the organisms change and the communities change. So there must be a source of de novo variation, new words, new grammar, or whatever new. And these new things, let's suppose that we have a new word. The fate of this word can be either random, by drift, determined by drift, or by selection, non-random. And if we have time at the end, I can give you some example of selection, because it's not very easy to understand it, but it's quite impressive actually. And also we have migration or dispersal or language exchange, borrowing of characteristics between languages. Of course, if we would like to do such a work, a theoretical work, a conceptual work in languages, it's not very easy. We can find the parallels very easy as we talk it now, but to determine, to make definitions of different concepts, it's not very easy. For example, what is individual in language? Linguists call it idiolect. Idiolect is the way that we are talking our mother language. And it is unique for each speaker. And each speaker, it can have two idiolects, for example, if it has two mother languages. Also, we have to define the unit of information. What is the unit of information? What is the gene in language? What is the target of selection? How does selection operate? And what is the unit of selection? For example, in organisms, we know that the unit of selection can be either the individual, or in sometimes the gene, and some rare times the population. What is the unit of selection here? What is the mutation? Or how does transmission of the characters, inheritance of the characters occur? This field needs to be researched. I mean, it needs to have a theoretical research here, which is, I think, very interesting. And we have tried to do that. There are, with some linguists that we collaborate, and I'm quite excited about this, this field. Of course, there is information about that here and there, but there is no a paper like Valence paper, for example, to describe the whole concept of the linguistic theory. Now, apart from this theoretical approach, also we can work with real data. Let me check the time, okay. With real data. There are several databases. I'll show you just one. This is the WALS databases. WALS is the World Atlas of Language Structures, and it contains many, many languages, actually thousands of languages all over the world. But basically, it has a sample of 100 languages, very well studied. It has a lot of information about them. And it gathers information about phonological, grammatical, and lexical properties of these languages. The interesting with language, I make a parenthesis here, the interesting is that it has different levels of information that you can compare. For example, one level is the words, okay, the lexical level. This is the comparison between the words, different languages. How do different languages say the same concept? For example, number one. In Indo-European, we have one in English, uno in Italian, enna in Greek. And linguists have found a way to quantify those differences. Okay, they call them cognates. They call them cognates, homologous words. But also there are other characteristics, for example, grammatical characteristics. And we are concentrated our study in those characteristics, in the grammatical characteristics. So we have 100 languages from WALS with a lot of information. And also we created, not we, actually our colleagues created, the linguists created a table of 60 languages from one single family, the Indo-European family. So you have 100 of languages all over the world. And for the same characteristics, we have 60 languages from Indo-European family. So we can compare both 100, a broad sample and a more narrow sample. And we create this kind of tables. Here is the languages, and here are the characteristics that we measure. For example, one characteristic is the genera, how many genera a language has. Feminine and masculine only, or it has also, there is variation in this character. How many genera? 2 genera, 3 genera, 5 genera sometimes, okay. So we can have values in these characters. And based on this table, it is like we study the morphological characters in biology, okay? We can make trees. We can make trees. This is actually a tree, a Bayesian tree that we produced. And this project also participates, Pavlos Pavlidis, who is attending this, who is lecturing in this seminar. This is the Indo-European, the tree of the Indo-European languages, 60 Indo-European languages based on the Waltz characters, and we used as an outgroup the Finnish. Actually, we could have used Turkish because Finnish and Turkish belong to the same family. And you see here the classification, the grouping. These are the Greeks and some dialects of the Greeks. These are the Romanic, the Slavic. Here are the Celtic languages here. These are the Slavic, and so on. So we can do trees with that. Are these trees correct or not? Well, this is quite a good tree, but the trees that the linguists publish based on structural data, on grammatical data, not on cognates. Cognates produce better trees, but on grammatical data, the trees are like this. For those of you that you have seen some phylogenetic trees, these trees are not very informative. And the question is why we cannot produce very resolved and well supported, statistically supported trees. I mean, Bayesian, for example, analysis or likelihood, all the methods give quite reliable trees for biology, for organisms. Why does that doesn't happen that in language? I think, I don't know, this is something that we investigate, but I think the reason is that the two systems, the biological system and the linguistic system, have different properties. And we cannot copy the methods from one system to apply them directly into another system, because the methods use some basic assumptions. For example, one major assumption that the trees, making phylogenetic trees, the basic assumption is, what is the basic assumption? Does anyone know? Write in the chat. If you want, if you don't, if you are shy to talk, just write it in the chat. What is the basic assumption of the phylogenetic trees? That the information is transmitted vertically. This is the major assumption. But in fact, in language, this is not very common. Of course, it is common. I mean, you have vertical inheritance, but also you have extensive horizontal transfer. And you can see it in this tree here that we produce. For example, if you see, these are the Greek languages and some dialects. And here is the Bulgarian, Macedonian, Albanian, and Romanian. And they are grouped very closely. This is the whole Balkan then. Why do the whole Balkan languages come together and group together? Because of course there is horizontal transfer. These languages have completely different genetic, linguistic background. They belong to different genera. The Greeks and the Albanian have their own genera. Bulgarian, Macedonian are Slavic, and Albanian and Romanian are Romanic, but they are grouped together. Right. So the time has passed, but I need just probably 5 minutes or 10 minutes at most to complete my talk. Do you want to have a break and continue, or do you prefer to continue like this? I need 10 more minutes at most, probably less than that. Okay. Right. So I showed you how we can work within this framework. I'll show you another example. Yeah, here I see that I show you that there are differences between the two systems, biology and linguistics, vertical inheritance, vertical and horizontal inheritance, parents. Biology organisms have 1 or 2 parents. Well, now there are 3 parents, kids, as you may know. In linguistics, you can have 1 or many parents, okay, because the way that I speak a language is not affected only by my physical parents, but also from the colleagues, or from schoolmates, or from animations in the TV and stuff like that. Inheritance of acquired characters? No, in biology. Yes, in linguistics. Exchange of information, not among species. Yes, between languages. Do we have exchange of information? And there aren't many differences. Okay, so I'll show you a second example based exactly on this on this same concept, that the languages evolve in a similar way like organisms evolve. This is a paper in PNAS a few years ago by Lyndall Bromham, who is a group of biologists, and Simon Greenhill, who's a linguist. Rate of language evolution is affected by population size. Again, population size is a pure biological evolutionary concept, actually, in this case. So these people here study Polynesian languages. You know that there is a high diversity in the Polynesian islands. Actually, these guys here are from New Zealand, from Australia and New Zealand. And they study cognates, homologues in words, homologues. Okay, they study that in species pair, in language pairs, close sister languages, and I'll show you just one example, one of their figures. Here are 10 different pairs of languages, and one is bigger population, and the other is smaller population. A bigger and smaller population is the number of speakers of the language, okay? And they measure how many new words have been introduced in these two languages and how many words have been lost from these two languages. They have a method to do that. I encourage you to read the paper. It's quite interesting. Here's the paper. Okay, so I isolated this only the first two the first pair of languages here. So this is the gain and this is the loss of languages. This distribution, the orange distribution, I think that this is orange or whatever, this color, the reddish, let's say, is the expected number of changes in smaller populations. And the blue color is the expected, the distribution of the expected number of changes in larger populations. And these bars here show the observed number of words that have been gained or lost. And you see that larger populations gain more words than smaller populations. But larger populations lose more words, less words than the smaller population. This is exactly what Drift predicts, that larger populations will gain more diversity because they have, well, if we make the analog for the organisms, the larger populations, they have more mutations, and the mutations within those, they pass more time like polymorphisms, and they lose, larger population lose variation slower, in a slower rate than smaller populations, because in smaller population, drift will drive the frequencies, the allele frequencies or the variance frequencies into two extremes. Right. So I gave you again two examples. I gave you two examples from every three cases of the evolutionary theory. Now, let's try to summarize. What do I told you that these three different systems have a lot of things, of different things. It is biological communities are different from languages, and organisms are different from biological communities and from languages. So each system has its unique characteristics, but also they have something in common. What do they have in common? All of them consist of populations of individuals, and the individuals have inheritable characters that they transmit in the next generations. And we have successive generations into time, one generation after the other in time. So if we predict that if we found these characteristics in a system, then this system will get evolved under the four processes that we have already described. That the evolutionary theory will be a framework for studying those systems. And we call these systems evolvable systems. Okay. So I think that this is quite neat, and I like this idea of the evolvable systems. And this is how the evolutionary theory can be extended. Of course, it has been developed for organisms, and that's why there is strong, it has strong theoretical background in for organisms. The evolution that we are studying in the universities, or we are teaching in the universities. And it is mathematically more improved because it is older. But I think, to my opinion, that it could have been developed for languages, for example. If linguists had a Darwin, then he would have, or she would have developed such a theory for for languages. Okay, so in summary of the talk, the power of a scientific theory is the extent of the natural phenomena that can explain. And you can see that the evolutionary theory is very elegant, very nice, only 4 processes. It needs, everything is explained under these 4 processes.
Είπα να το ψάξω και πήγα στο chat και μετά αυτοί μου στείλανε στο ίντερ και δεν είχα εγώ τον αριθμό μου, είχα κάτι παλιούς αριθμούς.
This wasn't me. Okay, so it has been Am I muted? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, sir.
Right, okay. So the evolutionary theory has been developed to explain the diversification of life, but it can be extended into other fields, as I presented it here. The common characteristics of these fields, of these systems, which are evolvable systems, we call them evolvable systems, is that they consist of populations of individuals, of replicating units with successive generation in time. This is their common characteristic. The evolutionary theory offers the theoretical background to make hypotheses in all evolvable systems, but each evolvable system has its unique characteristics. And so we can't get inspired from one system to apply it into the other, but we cannot copy the methods of one system to apply them to other, because we have to take into account the unique characteristic of each system. And you see that, for example, all the systems, also biology can, evolutionary biology can be benefited from the other systems. And I'll tell you an example for that. Many students always ask me if the epigenetics, for example, threatens the evolutionary theory. And because, I don't know very well these things, I was quite conservative. I say, okay, just wait for that. And we need to wait for that. But studying these languages where the horizontal, the inheritance of acquired characters is so extensive, you see that you still have evolution. So what I would say is that it's not necessary to have vertical transmission, absolute vertical transmission. Of course, definitely you need vertical transmission, but also with horizontal transfer or by inheritance of acquired characters, this might extend the evolutionary theory, if in case that we have evidence for that. It's not necessary to cancel or to threaten the evolutionary theory. It can enrich the evolutionary theory with the same way as the molecular data increased the power of the evolutionary theory. When the molecular data were introduced in the evolutionary theory with the theory of Kimura's and his students, then the evolutionary theory was broader, more extent. It could explain more things. And with this, I would like to thank you very much. And okay, I will leave you 1 hour for free because I think that you're quite tired. But if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.